Hello and welcome to The Career Compass, a podcast from Jurupa, a global search firm based out of the UK. For today's episode, I'm excited to welcome Miriam Jafroudi, a business conduct officer with Van Lanschot Kempen Investment Banking in the Netherlands. Welcome to the show, Miriam.
Thank you, Aaron. Happy to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm particularly excited because today is the first day I'm using this new platform called Riverside, and we've gone from audio only to video. So it's a big step forward for us. So thank you for being our first guest on the show in the new format.
Oh, I'm really honored. That is exciting for me as well. Haven't been on camera
Oh,
for quite some time, so
there you go. We're straight back into it. And how is 2024 going for you so far?
it is an interesting year, I have to say. The markets are picking up, so it's exciting. Busier than usual. We have had already a couple of deals going this year, so it's a positive development, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
Fantastic. Well, look, Miri, I'm going to jump right in with a relatively straightforward opening question, if I may. So you've been through quite a number of career changes, or you've gone through different kind of directions, different kind of methods of testing. When you were growing up back in Iran, did you always want to enter the legal profession, or did you have your
Absolutely
eye on
not.
another career path? No, it was
Absolutely
never in the
not.
plan.
That was not in the plans. Basically, when I was growing up, and it is very typical in an Iranian family, your family wants you to become a doctor. Well, I ended up becoming a doctor, but not the kind of doctor they wanted me to be.
Hmm.
And well, the plan was a little bit flawed for me because I'm not very particularly good with blood. I'm not afraid, but yeah, I just don't like it that much either.
Hmm.
So I was actually thinking I will eventually get over it and I will become a medical doctor. But then I decided that I want to go into engineering, then pure sciences, mathematics. But I eventually somehow landed on law. So go figure.
A sharp left turn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I recall reading somewhere that you worked together with a team of advisors to update Iran's laws and regulations on water rights and alternative water resources. So,
Yeah.
and that was a project that was presented to the Iranian parliament in 2016. I mean, what was that experience like?
That was an interesting experience, in particular because I was working with the Ministry of Energy, which is in charge of water issues in Iran. In
Hmm.
particular, we were looking into gray water, which is basically the water that you have used, but you can reuse it. Very important for Iran, given the drought that we are facing.
Yeah.
I was on that project until 2016, but from 2014 I was already outside of the country, so I just had a remote contact with the people on that project. It was presented to the parliament. Unfortunately, nothing really came out of it, which can
Yeah.
really help. But it was an interesting subject, in particular because of Iran being still quite dependent on agriculture. So water is quite important for some industries in Iran. Water is important, including the steel industry.
Hmm.
Yeah, uh, it's a shame
Yeah. No,
nothing came out of it.
it is a shame it didn't go anywhere because I mean, I imagine there are quite a few projects like this that get shelved or deprioritized, but that could have turned out to be quite a value add.
Yeah.
And then I understand from what I kind of read, you after qualifying as a lawyer, you hadn't originally planned to go into compliance, which is where you're sitting now. So what kind of led to that change of direction?
Very accidental, I have to say. So I started actually my legal career. I started my career as a journalist originally, but then I went into a legal career when I came to the Netherlands. And at the time, I worked for an arbitration firm. But when I was searching for another job after some time, I ended up in a position which was on the intersection of law and compliance. My manager was on the compliance side more than on the legal side, so she gradually nudged me towards compliance subjects, which was quite an experience in itself. And then yeah, it turned out I was good at it, so I just stay around.
Just blossom from there effectively.
Yeah.
And we're in a kind of environment where clearly the advent of AI, the regulatory changes in fintech over the last few years have kind of led to a culture of continuous adaptment, I guess, in terms of knowledge of laws, but also the way we kind of operate and think.
Yeah.
What do you kind of see as the forthcoming challenges, that are brought by AI? Maybe starting from that perspective, where are we going to have to kind of be a little bit more careful?
That's quite an interesting thing, because I have within my current position, what I do sometimes, I write some newsletters about developments, and two recent ones that are in connection directly with AI come to my mind. One
Mm,
has to do with an experiment that people did on the subject of market abuse, and the fact that
mm,
AI may actually act at the back of inside information. So we don't really know
yeah,
how to train AI on ethical behavior. We train AI on being helpful, which is an
mm,
interesting subject. How you
it
can train a
is.
machine which is not a sentient into being
Yes.
ethical. So
Yeah.
that is one thing. And on the other side, one other item that I recently read and then wrote about had to do with AI and basically fraud. It was a case in Hong Kong that happened, which
Mm,
essentially using deepfake technology, people
mm,
convince someone to pay quite some millions of dollars,
mm,
basically, um,
mm,
yeah, to, well, a shady account, essentially. I think AI is going to be a challenge. In one side of the coin, it is going to be very helpful because it can make your life easier. I have used AI to better my procedures, policies, etc.
yes.
But
Mm,
at the same time, because it's still quite a black box, if I may say, we don't know exactly
mm,
how things work. It
mm,
may be a little bit on the tricky side. That's why you need to have explainable AI so that you can really, yeah, really understand what the system is doing before you implement it. I think
yeah.
one other challenge that I see is that typically compliance officers, the profile that I see from compliance officers, they're not that much familiar with technology necessarily. So
Mm,
perhaps we also need to get some more tech oriented people within the industry in order to be able to
yes.
deal with those challenges.
I think so. And you've raised some interesting points on the more, maybe the more positive, efficient side. You have the ability to augment what people are doing. There's the ability to automate processes, of course, to reach conclusions quicker. I guess you could say. I mean, one interesting concept that's talked about quite frequently is if you were to ask a machine that's devoid of any emotion, arguably, and to take a completely neutral perspective, dispassionate view, what's the best way forward with this challenge or this difficulty, or here's a real dilemma that we have to decide upon. Let's let the computer decide. But then, of course, as we've seen with relatively recent examples, that they're not necessarily free of bias. Quite
Yeah,
often the machine is leaning one way or another. So it does raise some interesting points. I think the other thing that's interesting is the deepfake story.
yeah,
We were talking in a recent episode about the concept of having a head of state created in a deepfake video. Very convincingly, that video is then posted on a 24/7 news outlet to
yeah.
spread a message of chaos. And as you just said, people are willing to pay a fortune for various things to be achieved. So we do have to be a little bit careful. What's your
Absolutely.
perspective on guardrails and effective control of the development of AI? Do you think there should be certain protections in place?
I think, well, the regulatory environment definitely is going into that direction. So we are. I also have seen some regulators already speaking about it some time ago. And to a certain extent, I think we have to put safeguards in place. Otherwise, we are going to have chaos, as you mentioned, with the example of a head of state
Sure.
being
Yeah.
deepfaked. But at the same time, I am perhaps very pessimistic that we can do as much as we should. I think a technology typically is ahead of regulations.
Yeah.
And we will
Yeah.
have some time of chaos until we can, at least to a certain extent, put things, under control.
Yeah. I think you're right. Any kind of change in legislation or change in law, ethically or in terms of statutes, it tends to be the kind of result of an event or a disaster. Something it clearly didn't go to plan, therefore we need to change the law. It always tends to be in retrospect,
Yeah.
for whatever reason. But so going back to yourself, if you were to take a step back and review the degree of change you've witnessed as a compliance professional just in the last few years, what would you say has probably been the most impactful of all those changes?
I think the pace of regulations is just becoming more and more, because obviously the society is advancing more and more, and then you see many important regulations being passed during the past few years. I have gone myself through implementation of MiFID II, GDPR,
Yeah.
DORA. Well, Brexit, of course, was another side of the story.
Yes.
Now ESG becoming really important. So you see that quite a diverse area, a diverse subjects, regulatory subjects coming in, and is quite on a very fast pace. So you are barely finished with implementation of one when the new generation is coming in. So yeah, I think
Yes.
we are becoming more and more regulated, which is not a bad thing. I actually support regulation to a certain extent, but at the same
Mm.
time, the challenges also mount up.
I think so. One interesting strand to that discussion was sustainability and ESG. So huge growth in terms of ethical investment portfolios, ethical behavior, new regulations for corporations to follow in terms of emissions and following certain kind of rules. Uh, Most commentators seem to think that's only going to kind of grow in the next few years, although there is in some quarters a little bit of a pushback against net zero.
Yeah.
How do you kind of see the next maybe 5 to 10 years playing out? Do you see kind of further adoption of ESG and sustainability policies?
I think it depends on in which continent you're talking about. I think in Europe,
Mm.
especially in Nordics, you see that they are pushing more and more for it, and you also see a change
Yeah.
in the investor behavior. I already witnessed it a couple of years ago that certain investors are no longer interested in certain funds because they don't have an ESG profile, essentially.
Yeah.
But I think in some countries that ESG is not as broadly advocated for. I have seen also some pushbacks, for example, on parts of the ESG, not necessarily the sustainability part, but also on, equal opportunities for female managers, etc., etc. Some pushback
Mm.
I have seen in the media, at least on the US side, that this may not be working as well as we expected it to work.
Yeah.
And in certain areas of the world, sustainability is seen, and in particular in Middle East, I can say that in Iran, you see it as something which you do not necessarily put as your priority. Your
Mm.
priority are other things because of the economic situation, because you did not have the opportunities for development which were present for Europe. So I really
Yes.
think that globally we don't have the same balance. But yeah, we shall see. I think in Europe, at
Yeah.
least, we are going to see more regulations coming in and more investment, investor behavior change.
Yeah, I would tend to agree for sure. And it's very much geographically dependent. The person who doesn't have the luxury of a certain kind of supply of food or materials, maybe has less focus on it, whereas people in a European context, completely different story, as you say. It's kind of a lot of it is tied to kind of individual situations, to a large degree.
Yeah.
We just talked about AI and its impact. If we look at the legal sector in particular, there are some pretty fascinating legal tech startups being funded, seeking to grow pretty aggressively at this point. We're speaking to a few, tracking others. Much of the focus at this early stage, from what I can see, seems to be around process augmentation, improving the speed with which documents can be scanned and processed. So a lot of it's documentation processing. In future, here's a wild question, do you see the role of a judge in a court potentially being replaced by an AI?
Um, it's a weird question. I may be biased here, and I think no, you do not necessarily see a judge being replaced fully. It could be that a judge is helped quite a bit,
Mm.
but specifically depending also on the different class of legal basically background that they have. If you're talking about for example, Anglo-Saxon countries, I really think maybe you can replace a judge because a jury is the one deciding on whether someone is,
Yes.
is being convicted or not. But in certain countries, I really think that that human, unless we can have an AI with that human element into it,
Mm.
probably that human element still would have some some uh, role to play in being a judge because
Yeah.
some concepts
Yeah.
like leniency can we train an AI? I don't know. I'm going on a whim, but
No, it's interesting, and maybe it's a future milestone or future marker in terms of the evolution of AI as they get more and more um, you know, mirroring human emotions and judgments, as you say, as they go
yeah,
more and more advanced in that direction. There is the possibility. There was a story. I don't recall all the details, but I think the gist of it was there was a judge in the UK that actually consulted AI or ChatGPT or something similar to kind of seek some precedent or some context, further information around it. And I think that individual judge was kind of criticized and heralded in equal measure. Some people really supported him and said this demonstrates great foresight, great adaptability. Other people saying this is outrageous, that we're even consulting a machine, for answers or guidance. So it's going to be an interesting debate, I think, in the next few years.
that's very interesting because in one case, researchers showed that actually the ChatGPT or whatever it was lied about the precedents. So
Interesting.
that was a
Wow.
bias in it. So it's a very interesting subject.
Mm.
I think there are still we have come quite a lot of way with the current AI, but we are still very. It is. I think the use is still very premature at this stage. We are not there yet fully,
Yeah.
and even
Yeah.
if you use AI for simple questions, sometimes the mistakes are so obvious that you would
Yes.
say, "Well, we have AI, but perhaps it's not as intelligent as it should be."
As it should, absolutely. And there's always the potential for bad actors or negative influences,
Yeah,
hijacking the kind of code behind it, I guess. But we're certainly living in interesting times, no doubt about that.
yeah,
Um, Moving away from career stuff, let's talk maybe a little bit about things that help you relax. One of the things that came up, I think, when we were speaking in the past was one hobby you have is metal smithing and jewelry making. Very, very
yes,
interesting, a little bit different from the mainstream.
yes. A very
How did you get
expensive
into that?
hobby, I have to say.
Very, very expensive as well. So how did you
Yeah.
get into that kind of area?
I got into that as actually a form to get my stress out. So at first, I actually started with something very different, which was just macrame, essentially making friendship bracelets. But that did not
Yeah,
that did not stick around for a long time, and I wanted something
yeah,
more solid, something that you can work with and you can keep for a longer period of time. So I started with wire wrapping. From wire wrapping, I went into form folding, and all of that is different styles of working with metal. And it's eventually when I came to the Netherlands, I already had some tools with me. It was a very expensive flight, as you can imagine, because the tools are quite heavy. And then basically, I took a course here with Metalsmith. Uh, a couple of
interesting.
months, not for long, just 1 day a week. And
Ah,
afterwards, I started essentially using online courses, YouTube, etc., books, and now I do quite a bit with different
wow.
metals. So yeah,
It's quite
that's
a
how I
different
got
area.
into it.
It's yeah, yeah, really interesting. But I can imagine in terms of of a de-stressing approach.
Mhm.
There's kind of intricacy, there's concentration required. It's using the hands, so it's kinetic. So I can imagine it's quite a nice hobby to pursue. And it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting how you kind of transported the tools with you in the relocation to the Netherlands. So, any issues with metal detectors in the airport, or was it okay?
Not really. The only issue I had a quite a big brass plate with me, and when I was traveling in Turkey, they asked me what that was for, and I just told them,
Yeah,
and that was the only time that I had an issue, because everything
yeah,
else was check-in luggage. So yeah, you just
yeah.
declare as long as you don't have a gas with you, because I had torch with me, that's
Mhm.
fine. But yeah, it was an interesting trip, I have to say.
Yeah. Very interesting. I can imagine the customs official are not seeing these things every day, so probably
Yeah,
maybe out
that's
of
true.
curiosity as well as just checking things out.
Yeah.
And obviously, with you having worked in different jurisdictions and interacted with entities all over the world, how would you compare the Dutch national psyche to say that of Iran or the Middle East in general? How are the kind of cultural differences you've observed?
It's an interesting question because many people ask me, "Don't you miss home?" And I actually feel more at home in Netherlands than I ever was in Iran. And the
Mhm.
reason is that people in Netherlands are very direct and they are very pragmatic. Those traits I really appreciate. I have been also in. I've worked in Spain. I lived in Spain. I like the warmness of the people of Spain, but from a work perspective, I think I really like the Netherlands because usually you find solutions for the problems because of their pragmatic approach. It is very clear what they want and what they intend because they are
Yeah.
very direct. In
Yes.
Middle East, you hear something, but what they mean is complete opposite. So we do have a term for it in Persian. We call it taruf, which means that sometimes if you're going to a shop, they tell you, "Oh, you don't have to pay for this," but they don't really mean it. You have to say, "No, I insist,"
Oh,
and
right.
that does not exist in.
Three
Yeah,
or
and
four times.
that's something culturally expected from you. And I gave the example of a shop, but even in corporate environments, that is the same story. They say, "Okay, no, you don't have to do this," but they mean that you better do it yesterday better than today,
Yeah.
actually.
It's kind of
So
an indirect meaning. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so that is one element that I really appreciate, and the second element is the fact that in Netherlands there is for women and for people who, well, for non-male population, let me put it that way, there's
Mm.
more opportunities to actually thrive and grow.
Yeah.
I in Iran when I was working in a different industry, but one time my manager said, "I can never put you in a management position because you're a woman and no one is going to
Wow.
respect you."
So
Um,
different, isn't it? Wow.
yeah, it's so different.
Yeah.
While in my current company, the CEO of my current company is a person who actually promotes women, and
Mm.
he actually sponsors uh, basically a forum that we have within the company in order to give more opportunities to female
Mm.
co-workers.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's quite a different environment. So I really feel more
Yeah.
at home, more at ease in the Netherlands.
Far more
Of course, there
opportunities
are
in that regard from a career perspective. Yeah.
yeah,
Chances to
of course
advance
there
and
are
yeah.
struggles as well because obviously I have not been raised in this culture, so there are some times that there are some clashes, but they are
Mm.
very welcoming. And sometimes to the extent that I'm like, please don't be as welcoming. One challenge for
Mm.
me has been learning the Dutch language. I think you know my challenge. We have spoken about this
Yes.
because they
Yeah.
are so welcoming that they try to accommodate you. They always speak English with you, while
Yeah.
perhaps if they would refrain from that, you learn a little bit faster. So,
You can't
yeah,
learn because they're automatically kind of politely switching to fluent English, and
yeah,
it's one of those
and with
countries,
all good
probably.
intentions, with all good
Yeah, yeah,
intentions. Yeah,
all with good intentions, but in terms of the levels and standards of English, it's super high. It's up there with maybe Sweden and Denmark. It's
yeah,
just super high level. Nearly everywhere, you're actually more hard pressed to find someone that isn't speaking really high level English. So pretty
Absolutely.
impressive. We've actually had a few Dutch guests on the podcast over the last few kind of months, and I remember one discussion talked about some time that this GM spent out in the Far East, who's in Japan, and he kind of picked up somewhere or reached the conclusion that the kind of style of communication was probably about as far away as the Dutch one as possible, like the opposite end in Japan. So many kind of indirect ways to try and get to a no or a negative, and in Netherlands it's a different story, but it's
Yeah.
done with politeness, but it's direct, it's pragmatic. So interesting differences around the world.
Yeah, yeah, I tend to agree. And of course, I have not had a direct experience with Japan, but I did have a course during my studies which was focusing on cultural differences. And I've heard that also from my professor that in Japan
Mm.
things are very different. So I can
So
imagine
different.
that.
I mean, one of my favorite stories about that kind of really highlighted one of the loveliest things about the Japanese culture was in the Football World Cup not long ago, probably the most recent World Cup. After a game, when the Japanese had kind of lost and they were, finishing the group, going home, they spent, I think, 2 hours, 3 hours cleaning up the
Yeah,
stadium.
yeah,
Unbelievable, to have been kind of taught in such a way and have such courtesy and politeness,
yeah,
and do it in a collaborative way was really impressive. Really kind of
absolutely. Yeah,
it gave
I've
them a
heard that
huge kind of
story as
boost.
well. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic stuff. I've got one more question for you, if I may. We've talked a little bit about training in different career directions and advice along the way, observing different cultures. I'd like to ask my guests about business books. If there was one business book that you would recommend for our listeners to read out of all of the fantastic ones that are out there, would there be one that you'd suggest to others?
Yeah, I actually do have quite well a taste for nonfiction books,
Yeah.
but my go-to book in my profession, obviously, because I do have a background in compliance, is Why They Do It. I think it's the full, essentially, title is Why They Do It Inside the Mind of the White Collar Criminals.
Hmm.
And that has to do mostly with market abuse, but other things as well. And I think it's an interesting read, specifically because usually people assume that the intention is greed. It's not as black and white. The
No.
intention can be anything. The intrigue can be the intention. Sometimes the intention might even not be a bad intention, but you end up doing something which is criminal. And that book
Hmm.
is a very well researched book in my field, so I really give
Interesting.
reference to it quite a lot. So that is one of my favorite ones.
Well, with your permission, I'll include the link to that in the episode guide so that people can check it out. Maybe you can send me the link,
Of course, I will
Amazon
see.
or similar. That'd be great. Thank you. And I'll take a look at it myself. I know that one of the things that kind of came up a lot in the past when I'm talking to compliance professionals is that they're kind of always seen as the policeman or the policewoman. They're the blocker. They're stopping you. They're saying, no, you can't do this. Yeah. But actually, it's far more nuanced than that. You're
Yeah,
effectively acting as the person that's ensuring the company's on a safe path. There have to be guardrails in place, and in the end, you're kind of there to forewarn of danger and going down the wrong track. So it's maybe this book will illuminate that point better than I can, at least.
yeah. To a certain extent, that is a challenge that we always have with compliance. And right now, I'm working with first line, so I'm no longer compliance, and I see that the view on first line is a little bit, as you said, that compliance is the police. But how I was, and I always say how I was raised in the compliance culture, is that compliance has to let you know how you can achieve the goals that you want to achieve within the boundaries of laws and regulations. So how to navigate that, and you should not be a business blocker but a business enabler. And I think that is essentially what we need to the professionals need to remember. And on the business side, I also say sometimes if they're blocking you, it's probably because there is no other way. Because at the end of the day, the business is who brings in the money. If the business is not working, compliance is not going
Right.
to eat. Therefore, it
Exactly.
has to be it has to be a balance between the two.
yeah, if the business is being investigated by a regulatory authority or being shut down, then there is no revenue, there are no jobs. So it's a
Yeah,
pretty critical part of the role. Well, Miriam, it's been great having you on the show. Really appreciate you taking the time and for being the first person to appear on video format. So uh, hopefully first of
I
many.
feel so privileged.
Very, very welcome. And come back again at some point. We'll talk some more. Uh,
Gladly, of
if
course.
anyone watching wishes to pose a question or get in touch with myself or Miriam, you'll find our email addresses enclosed within the episode description along with that book. And
Yes.
we would welcome the opportunity to answer any queries you may have.
Yeah.
So until next time, thank you, Miriam, and all the very best to everyone out there.
Same to you.
Bye bye.
Bye.